A desperate call for help. Ensign Jake Briggs stifled a yawn as he leaned back in his pilot's chair aboard the small scout ship Orion. He had been tasked with patrolling an uncharted sector at the fringe of known space. It was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission, but Jake couldn't shake off the feeling that something big was about to happen. Suddenly, a shrill alarm pierced through Orion's hull. Jake bolted upright, eyes scanning his instrument panel until they landed on the source, an urgent distress call coming from a nearby planet. He quickly honed in on the signal and activated the translator matrix. Crash landed. Slave ship, need immediate assistance. The message crackled through bursts of static before flickering out completely. Jake felt his heart lurch when he heard the words slave ship. Even in this advanced age of interstellar exploration, there were still those who profited from trafficking sentient beings. It sickened him to his core. Protocol dictated that he should report back to command and await further instructions. But as he looked at the rapidly deteriorating vital signs attached to the distress call, Jake knew every second counted. There was no time for bureaucracy when lives hung in the balance. With a determined set to his jaw, Jake overrode Orion's programmed flight path and punched in new coordinates, directing the ship to descend towards the uncharted planet's surface. As he broke through the atmosphere, Jake was greeted by a desolate landscape of jagged mountains and deep ravines. Visibility was poor due to a thick layer of fog, forcing him to rely on his instrumentation to navigate. It took a few tense minutes, but eventually the ship's scanners locked onto the wreckage of a large vessel smashed against the base of a colossal cliff face. The distress beacon grew stronger as Jake brought Orion down for a rough landing on an outcropping nearby. Not wasting any time, he threw on his tactical exosuit and grabbed his pulse rifle before dashing out onto the planet's inhospitable surface. The air was thin and choked with acrid fumes that made Jake's eyes water despite his helmet's filtration system. Every step felt heavier than usual under the increased gravity. Undeterred, Jake pushed onward until he reached what remained of the alien slave ship. The once sleek craft was now a twisted husk of burnt metal. It must have been a hell of a crash. Using his suit-enhanced strength, Jake wrenched open a partially caved-in airlock and stepped cautiously into the wreckage. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across mangled bulkheads and dangling wires. The cloying scent of burnt circuitry and singed flesh assaulted Jake's senses. A weak groan caught his attention, spurring Jake deeper into the devastated ship. He rounded a corner to find a nightmarish scene. Dozens upon dozens of containment pods lined the walls, their hatches buckled and warped from the impact. But what made Jake's blood boil were the occupants, a multitude of alien females belonging to several distinct species. Some were slumped over lifelessly, while others stirred feebly. Even at a glance, Jake could see that these women had been horribly mistreated long before the crash. Their frail bodies were marred by bruises and scars that spoke of unimaginable cruelty. Makeshift slave collars glinted coldly around each of their necks. As he approached the nearest pod, the alien inside recoiled in terror, her iridescent eyes wide with primal fear. Jake raised his open hands in a universal gesture of peace. "Easy there," he said, keeping his voice soft and even. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." The alien woman stared at Jake uncomprehendingly. The language barrier was going to be a problem, but Jake hoped his tone and body language would convey his intentions. Gingerly stepping over piles of debris, Jake began checking for survivors, prying open pods and trying his best to offer comfort to the frightened occupants. More than a few shied away from his touch, whimpering pitifully. It broke Jake's heart. He was about to force open another containment unit when the shadow of movement caught Jake's eye. He whirled around with lightning speed, bringing his rifle up to firing position in a heartbeat. A tall, lithe alien female stood before him, her posture tense and coiled like a cornered predator. Unlike the others, she wore the tattered remnants of some kind of combat armor. Green scales glinted along her arms and legs while a crest of horn-like protrusions curved back from her skull. Most striking were her eyes, vivid yellow orbs that blazed with fierce intelligence and determination despite the grim situation. "Who are you?" the alien demanded in translated galactic common. "Why have you come here?" Jake slowly lowered his rifle, sensing that this woman was more than just another captive. Perhaps she could be the key to unraveling this whole sordid affair. "Ensign Jake Briggs, United Terran Federation," he replied, standing at ease but still on guard. "I intercepted your distress call and came to investigate. My goal is to get you and the others to safety." The alien woman studied him intently, her gaze flickering from his face to the insignia on his suit. "I am called Zara, once a warrior of the Saurian Dominion," she said after a long, tense moment. "Forgive my suspicion, but the last humans we encountered were the ones who sold us into slavery." Jake felt a surge of anger course through him. The idea that his own species could be responsible for such atrocities sickened him to his core. "Those were not true humans," Jake declared firmly, locking eyes with Zora. "I give you my word, on my honor as a soldier, that I will do everything in my power to free you and the others." Zara held his gaze for a heartbeat longer before nodding curtly. It was clear that trust would not come easily, but it was a start. Together, the human soldier and the Saurian warrior began the daunting task of liberating the captives and searching for a way off this desolate planet. Little did they know, their trials were only just beginning. Fragile alliances. As Jake and Zara worked side by side to free the remaining slaves, a tense silence hung between them, broken only by the occasional whimper or groan from the battered captives. Jake could feel Zara's eyes on him, watching his every move with wary calculation. He couldn't really blame her for the distrust. If what she said about humans being involved in the slave trade was true, Jake could only imagine the kind of betrayal and trauma these women had endured. Earning their faith would be an uphill battle. With the last of the containment pods forced open, Jake took stock of the situation. Many of the freed slaves were in rough shape, malnourished, dehydrated, and nursing injuries ranging from minor cuts to potentially life-threatening internal wounds sustained during the crash. They needed medical attention urgently. "Orion has a small medbay that should be able to handle the most critical cases," Jake said, gesturing towards his ship in the near distance. "We can ferry the wounded there in small groups." Zara nodded curtly, her expression unreadable. "And then what?" "We cannot stay here indefinitely. Those slavers will come looking for their lost cargo." Jake's jaw clenched at the casual dehumanization. No one deserved to be treated as mere property. "I'll call for backup once we get everyone situated," he replied, already working out the logistics in his head. "The Federation has strict laws against slavery. We'll hunt down those responsible and make sure they face justice." A flicker of something, skepticism, perhaps, flashed across Zora's reptilian features, but she held her tongue and moved to help an injured avian female to her feet. Over the next few hours, Jake and Zara transported the freed slaves to Orion's cramped medbay in careful shifts. Exhaustion tugged at Jake as he distributed ration bars and water packs among the huddled groups, but he pushed through on sheer willpower. These women were depending on him. Suddenly, a shrill alarm pierced the air, sending a jolt of adrenaline surging through Jake's system. He lunged for the nearest console, fingers flying across the interface. "Proximity alert," he called out grimly. Multiple ships approaching fast. Zara materialized at his side, in an instant, yellow eyes narrowing as she studied the readouts. "Slave traders," she spat, lip curling to reveal needle-sharp teeth. "They found us sooner than expected." Jake felt his stomach drop. Orion was a capable vessel, but she was no warship. Against a group of heavily armed slavers, they would be hopelessly outgunned. And with so many wounded under their care, fleeing wasn't an option either. Think, Jake, think. He racked his brain desperately for a solution. They needed to even the odds somehow, buy enough time for reinforcements to arrive. "The ion cannon," Zara said abruptly, as if reading his mind. At Jake's startled look, she flashed a razor-edged smile. "This ship is Saurian make. I know her capabilities. Hope kindled in Jake's chest as caught her meaning. The ion cannon was an area denial weapon, designed to disable rather than destroy. If they could lure the slavers into its range and hit them with an EMP burst, it might just give them the advantage they needed. We'd have to leave Orion to operate it manually, he thought aloud, running quick calculations. It'll be dangerous with the slavers so close. I'll do it, Zora declared, her tone brooking no argument. I have more combat experience. You stay here and protect the others. Part of Jake, the chivalrous part, wanted to argue, to insist on taking the risk himself. But the cool, logical side recognized the wisdom of her words. Zara was a warrior born and bred. If anyone could pull this off, it was her. Okay, he agreed reluctantly, heart clenching with an unfamiliar flutter of worry. But be careful out there. We still need you. An unreadable emotion flickered across Zora's face before vanishing behind her usual stoic mask. She gave a curt nod and slipped away to arm herself, moving with sinuous grace. As he watched her go, Jake tried to ignore the voice in the back of his mind, whispering that he might never see the fierce Saurian woman again. A strange hollowness took root in his chest at the thought. No, he couldn't think like that. They would both make it through this, somehow. Failure was not an option. Tearing his gaze away, Jake hurried to organize what few defenses he could, distributing the meager cache of weapons from Orion's armory among those slaves, still able to fight, and erecting makeshift barricades from the remnants of the wrecked ship. All the while, his thoughts raced with contingency plans and backup strategies. In the distance, he could just make out the glowing thrusters of the approaching slavers, growing steadily larger like the eyes of some ravenous beast closing in on wounded prey. Jake felt his heart thudding against his ribs as he checked the charge on his rifle one last time, finger hovering over the trigger guard. Every instinct screamed at him to rush headlong into battle, to put himself between the oncoming threat and the innocent lives depending on him. But he had to trust in Zora now, trust that she would come through for them all. It went against his every protective impulse to let her face the danger alone, but Jake forced himself to have faith. The human soldier straightened his shoulders and steeled his resolve, prepared to hold the line for as long as it took. No matter what happened, he would see this through to the end. He just prayed it would be enough. Desperate measures. A hush fell over Orion's battered hull as Jake and the few able-bodied slaves took up defensive positions, weapons trained on the slowly sealing airlock. The approaching slaver ships had touched down just outside, no doubt disgorging their cruel occupants to reclaim their property. Jake's finger curled around the trigger of his rifle, every muscle coiled in tense anticipation. His heart pounded a staccato rhythm against his ribs as he strained his senses for any sign of the enemy. Beside him, an insectoid female, Xyloth, he recalled vaguely, chittered nervously, her compound eyes glittering with fear. Further down the line, a towering reptilian male, Krogan. Jake wasn't sure of the species name, hefted a massive hammer, scarred lips pulled back in a defiant snarl. These were no trained soldiers. They were the broken and the desperate, armed with little more than scavenged weapons and raw determination. Against the hardened slavers outside, their odds of survival were slim. But what they lacked in experience, they made up for in sheer grit. Jake could see it etched into every taut line of their battered bodies, that innate, unbreakable will to live, to be free. It ignited something fierce and proud in his chest. "Hold steady," he called out, voice low but resonant with command. "Aim for center mass. Make every shot count." A chorus of acknowledgement rippled through the Ragdig defenders, a grim sort of solidarity taking root amidst the fear. They would not go quietly into the night. Seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Jake sent a silent prayer winging into the cosmos, for Zora's success, for a miracle, for anything that might tip the scales in their favor. And then, with a bone-jarring clang, the airlock began to cycle open. Instantly, Jake's world narrowed to the slim gap, his finger tightening imperceptibly on the trigger. Every breath felt too loud in his helmet, every heartbeat a deafening drumbeat in his ears. The seal of the airlock broke with a hiss of decompressing air. Jake braced himself for a storm of blaster fire, for the war cries of charging slavers. But none came. Instead, an eerie silence pooled into the ship, thick and heavy with dread. Confusion knotted Jake's brow. What were the slavers waiting for? Had Zara managed to disable them after all? Signaling for the others to hold position, Jake crept forward, every sense on high alert. The straining metal of the airlock groaned open millimeter by millimeter, ratcheting the tension higher with each passing second. And then, Jake saw it. A gleam of polished armor, a dull red visor, but neither belonged to any slaver. His breath caught in his throat. Beside him, the Xyloth hissed a curse, mandibles clicking in agitation. Pantheon's blade, Jake murmured grimly, recognizing the distinctive appearance of the galaxy's most fearsome mercenary group. What the hell are they doing here? The airlock finished its achingly slow journey, revealing a full squad of the black-clad warriors, each bristling with an arsenal of high-end weapons. They moved with the coiled menace of apex predators as they stepped onto Orion, fanning out in perfect unison. One merc, taller and broader than the others, detached from the group and strode towards Jake with purposeful steps. Twin plasma blades ignited in his hands, crackling with barely restrained energy. A single red stripe adorned his matte black helmet, a sign of officer rank. "Surrender the slaves," the merc leader growled, his voice a guttural rasp through the filters of his helmet, "and I will grant you the mercy of a quick death, human." Jake felt his lip curl in disgust as he shifted into a ready stance, rifle aimed squarely at the other male's faceplate. So Pantheon's blade had thrown in their lot with the slavers. He shouldn't have been surprised. The mercenary group had a reputation for brutality that bordered on the sadistic. "Not gonna happen," Jake bit out. "These people are under my protection now. You want them. You go through me." The dark chuckle escaped the merc leader, sending icy rivulets down Jake's spine. "Foolish boy," he rumbled, a note of cruel amusement threading his words. "Do you really think you stand a chance against the might of Pantheon's blade?" As if in answer, a tremendous explosion rocked Orion, throwing Jake and his small force off balance. Alarm klaxons blared as the ship shuddered under the impact. "Warning, hull breach detected," the infuriatingly calm voice of the ship AI announced. "Structural integrity compromised." Jake's blood ran cold. Had the mercs planted explosives? No, the blast had come from outside, which meant realization slammed into him like a gut punch. Zara, the ion cannon. A high-yield detonation like that could only mean one thing. Numbness spread through Jake's chest as he pictured the fierce Saurian warrior, her proud bearing, her peer. Jake's heart seized in his chest as the awful realization sank in. Zara, the fierce Saurian warrior who had become his unexpected ally, must have sacrificed herself to detonate the ion cannon, taking out the slaver reinforcements, but also sealing her own fate in the process. Grief and rage warred within him, threatening to drag him under. But he couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now, not with Pantheon's blade still a very real threat aboard the crippled Orion. Wrenching his focus back to the merc leader, Jake channeled every ounce of pain and fury into cold, hardened purpose. Zara's sacrifice would not be in vain. "You want these people," he gritted out, finger tightening on the trigger. "Come and get them." With speed that belied his bulky armor, the merc leader lunged, plasma blades sizzling through the air in a deadly arc. Jake threw himself sideways, narrowly evading dismemberment. All around him, the once quiet corridor erupted into chaos as the slaves and mercs clashed. The bark of gunfire mingled with the hum of energy weapons and the meaty thud of bodies colliding. Rolling to his feet, Jake squeezed off a rapid volley of shots, forcing the merc leader to deflect with his whirling blades. The plasma seared through bulkheads and supply crates, showering the combatants with sparks. Jake pressed his momentary advantage, lightning reflexes and adrenaline sharpening him into a weapon of singular focus. He drove the Merc leader back with a relentless barrage, trying to gain some distance. Behind him, the Xylof shrieked a blood-chilling battle cry as she leaped onto the back of another Pantheon warrior, stabbing with a viciousness born of desperation. The Krogan bellowed with berserker rage, hammer smashing through armor like tinfoil. But for every mercenary that fell, two more seemed to take their place. They were hideously outnumbered and outgunned. It was only a matter of time before. Jake cried out as searing agony exploded in his shoulder, a plasma bolt sizzling through his armor. The Merc leader capitalized on his split second of distraction, closing the distance with terrifying speed. A vambrace smashed into Jake's helmet, sending him reeling. Stars burst across his vision, the coppery taste of blood flooding his mouth. He hit the deck plates hard, rifle skittering from his grip. Instinct alone saved him from the downward plunge of a plasma blade, throwing his body into a frantic sideways roll. The Merc leader was on him in an instant, a black boot slamming down on Jake's wounded shoulder. This time, he couldn't bite back his howl of pain. Pathetic. The Merc sneered, grinding his heel viciously. Did you really think a lone human could stand against the might of Pantheon's blade? Jake glared up at his enemy, hatred searing through the fog of pain. He spat a glob of blood onto the gleaming black armor. The Merc leader grabbed the front of Jake's armor, hauling him up until they were faceplate to faceplate. Twin red slits burned into Jake's eyes, promising a slow, agonizing death. I'm going to enjoy watching you die, boy, the Merc hissed, a plasma blade humming to life in his peripheral. And then I'm going to drag these slaves back to the flesh markets myself. Despair threatened to swallow Jake whole. He had failed. Failed Zara, failed the slaves, failed his mission. All his efforts, all their sacrifices, for nothing. His searching fingers brushed the grip of his fallen rifle. One last spark of defiance flared in Jake's chest. If he was going to die here, he would die fighting, like Zara. With a wordless snarl, Jake snatched up his weapon and slammed it into the Merc's side. Caught off guard, the Pantheon leader's grip loosened just enough for Jake to tear free. He staggered back, bringing his rifle to bear with arms that trembled from pain and fatigue. The Merc recovered quickly, plasma blades flashing as he charged with a roar of fury. Jake squeezed the trigger, and nothing happened. His rifle beeped a negative tone, energy pack depleted. A cold, numb acceptance swept through him. So this was how it ended. At least he would face his death on his feet, weapon in hand. Jake braced himself for the killing blow. But it never came. Instead, a blinding blue-white light exploded through the corridor, searing Jake's retinas, even through his helmet's protective filters. He threw up an arm instinctively, squinting against the glare. The Merc leader stood frozen in mid-lunge, hallowed by the strange radiance. And then, to Jake's utter shock, the Pantheon warrior simply crumbled, armor and all, into a fine black ash that settled gently onto the deck plates. Blinking away spots, Jake gaped at the 24 Pantheon-shaped piles of dust that now littered the corridor. The Mercs had been completely disintegrated. What the hell? He breathed, struggling to process the impossible scene. A familiar figure emerged from the fading light, green scales glinting red with blood, both alien and her own. Fierce yellow eyes found and held Jake's, blazing with an emotion he couldn't name. Zara. His voice cracked on the name, scarcely daring to hope. How? The Saurian woman flashed him a deadly smile, hefting a strange-looking weapon. It thrummed with residual energy, like a beast sated. For now. A parting gift from the slavers, she purred. They won't be needing their particle disruptor anymore. Jake barked a laugh that bordered on hysteria, relief and disbelief warring in his chest. She was alive. Battered, bleeding, but beautifully, impossibly alive. He limped towards her on unsteady legs, reaching out to clasp her forearm in a warrior's grip. Zara returned the pressure, something warm and fierce kindling in her gaze. "I thought I'd lost you," Jake rasped, the words tearing out of him. "When I heard the explosion." "You should know by now, human," Zara murmured, leaning in close. "I don't die easily." Jake could only nod, throat too tight for words. In that moment, he knew with bone-deep certainty that the bond they had forged in the crucible of battle was something rare and precious, something worth fighting for. Together, the human soldier and the Saurian warrior turned to survey the carnage, and the shell-shocked, but alive, faces of the slaves they had freed. There would be time enough to mourn the fallen, to process the trauma of all they'd endured. But for now, they had survived. Against all odds, they had clawed their way out of the jaws of hell itself. And with Zara by his side, Jake felt a flicker of something that might have been hope kindle in his chest. The battle was won, but the war for the slaves' freedom had only just begun. No quiet on the home front. The journey back to civilization was a somber affair, the elation of their hard-won victory tempered by the weight of the fallen. Jake stood at the helm of the liberated slave ship, his gaze fixed on the starry expanse ahead as he tried to banish the ghosts that clung to him. 27 slaves had perished in the battle against the mercenaries. 27 lives he hadn't been able to save. Their faces, each unique, each precious, flashed through his mind in an endless loop of silent accusation. A gentle touch on his shoulder startled him out of his dark thoughts. He glanced over to see Zara watching him with those piercing yellow eyes, her expression uncharacteristically soft. "You did everything you could," she said quietly, her voice a low rasp in the stillness of the cockpit. "More than anyone else would have. Their deaths are not on your hands." Jake swallowed hard, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Doesn't feel that way," he muttered, looking away. "I was supposed to protect them, to get them all to safety. I failed." Zara's grip tightened, her claws pricking his skin through the fabric of his undersuit. "No, Jake. You gave them something far more precious than safety. You gave them a chance to fight for their freedom, to die with honor, rather than live as slaves. There is no greater gift." The use of his given name caught Jake off guard. Until now, Zora had only ever called him human or ensign. The intimacy of it, combined with the unexpected compassion in her words, sent a warm shiver down his spine. He met her gaze, searching for any hint of platitude or pity. He found only a steely sincerity that took his breath away. "Thank you," he rasped, the words feeling woefully inadequate. I needed to hear that." Zara held his gaze for a heartbeat longer before releasing him with a nod. "Get some rest," she advised, not unkindly. "You'll need your strength for what comes next." With that cryptic comment, she slipped out of the cockpit, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts once more. He managed a few fitful hours of sleep in the captain's quarters before a chime from the comms panel dragged him back to groggy consciousness. Ensign Briggs, the voice of Admiral Zhukov, his commanding officer, crackled through the speakers, tight with barely restrained impatience. "You've got some explaining to do." Jake scrubbed a hand down his face, trying to marshal his sleep-deprived thoughts. "Sir, I can explain." "You went AWOL, son," Zhukov cut him off, each word dripping with disappointment. "Disobeyed direct orders. Commandeered a Federation vessel for an unsanctioned mission. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't have you court-martialed the second you make port." Jake squared his shoulders, the final pieces of a plan that had been slowly taking shape in his mind clicking into place. When he spoke again, his voice was steady with conviction. "Because I found something out there, sir. Something big. Bigger than one soldier or one mission." He took a deep breath, knowing his next words would change the course of his life irrevocably. "The Federation has a leak, Admiral. Someone on the inside has been working with the slavers, feeding them intel, helping them stay one step ahead of our patrols." Silence greeted his declaration. Jake could practically hear the gears turning in Zhukov's head as the Admiral processed the bombshell he'd just dropped. I sincerely hope you have ironclad proof to back up an accusation of that magnitude, Ensign, came the eventual, cautious reply, leveling those charges against a fellow officer. Oh, I've got proof, sir, Jake said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. But not just against one officer. Against an entire system that's become complacent. Corrupt. Jake paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. When he continued, his voice was low and intense, each word chosen with deliberate care. I've seen the true face of slavery now, Admiral. Touched the evil of it. And I can tell you this, our half measures and slap-on-the-wrist penalties aren't even putting a dent in the trade. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the console. The Federation needs to stop pretending this is just another criminal enterprise to police. We're at war, sir. A war for the soul of the galaxy itself. And if we don't start fighting like it, putting everything we have into stamping out this atrocity, then we're no different than the bastards profiting from it. Another beat of silence stretched into the cabin. The Admiral's voice was carefully neutral when he finally replied, betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. You're treading on thin ice, Briggs. Even if what you say is true, going outside the chain of command like this, it won't win you any friends in the brass. Jake felt a grim smile curve his lips. I'm not looking to make friends, sir. I'm looking to burn the slave trade to ashes. Whatever it takes. Shukov made a considering noise. And your plan to accomplish this monumental feat? I have a few ideas, Jake said, a glint of something hard and determined kindling in his eyes. But first, I have 112 traumatized former captives who need sanctuary. A chance to heal. To rediscover who they are beyond the chains that held them. He took a steadying breath. And I know just the place. At his side, the comms panel lit up with an incoming transmission from a familiar frequency. Jake reached out and hit accept without hesitation. A hologram flickered to life above the console, solidifying into the proud, regal features of a woman he had seen only in history vids, yet instantly recognized. Empress Andromeda, Jake greeted, inclining his head with genuine respect. Thank you for agreeing to take my call. The matriarch of the Dawn Collective, the most powerful free state in the quadrant, a shining beacon of hope for the oppressed and downtrodden, regarded him with eyes as ancient and unfathomable as the stars themselves. Ensign Briggs, she acknowledged, her voice a melodic lilt that commanded attention. Your reputation precedes you. The collective has heard of your valiant efforts to liberate those held in bondage. She paused, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And of the rather unorthodox methods you employed to accomplish this feat. Jake felt his spine straighten under her assessing gaze, a frisson of awe and trepidation skittering down his nerves. This was a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who wielded the power to shape the very course of history. And she was the key to everything he had planned. I do what I must, Your Majesty, Jake replied simply. For my conscience, and for the good of the galaxy. Andromeda inclined her head, a glimmer of approval in her timeless eyes. A noble sentiment, young warrior, one that has been sorely lacking in the halls of power of late. Her expression turned somber. The collective has long been a haven for those fleeing the yoke of oppression, a place of healing and new beginnings. I would be honored to extend our hospitality to those you have freed. Jake felt the knot of tension between his shoulders loosen fractionally. Thank you, Your Majesty. Your generosity will not be forgotten. And in return, the Empress prompted, a knowing glint in her eye. Jake met her gaze squarely, unflinching. In return, I humbly request the support of the collective in my mission to dismantle the slave trade once and for all. Your resources, your influence, and your blessing to operate outside the bounds of Federation law. Andromeda regarded him thoughtfully, the weight of millennia behind her piercing gaze. You ask much, Ensign. To sanction what would amount to a vigilant campaign. It is not a decision I make lightly. She leaned forward, her holographic form flickering. but neither can I deny the righteousness of your cause, nor the fire I see burning in your spirit, a fire I have not seen the likes of in generations." The Empress straightened, an aura of regal authority settling over her like a mantle. "Very well, Jake Briggs, you shall have what you seek. The full might of the collective will be at your disposal in your crusade against the slavers." A fierce grin split Jake's face, the first true spark of hope igniting in his chest since this whole nightmare began. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I swear to you, on my life and my honor, I will not rest until every slave in this galaxy is free." Andromeda smiled. "Of that, young warrior, I have no doubt." And with that, a partnership was forged that would shake the very foundations of galactic civilization, a partnership built on the unbreakable bond between an uncompromising soldier and an empire of the oppressed. Together, they would bring the slavers to their knees, or die trying. As the hologram of the Empress flickered out, Jake turned to face his own commanding officer, still waiting on the other comm line. "Admiral Zhukov, sir, I'm afraid I won't be returning to the Federation. There's work to be done out here. Important work, and I intend to see it through." He paused, steel in his voice. "With or without your blessing." Lighting the spark, the newly liberated slave ship streaked through the glittering expanse of space, its engines straining as it pushed towards the coordinates provided by the Empress, towards sanctuary and a new beginning for the lost souls aboard. Jake stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the viewscreen as the swirling vortex of a wormhole yawned open before them, a shimmering portal to the heart of the Dawn Collective. Zara stepped up beside him, her presence a silent pillar of strength. In the days since their escape from the slave camp, a bond had grown between the human soldier and the Saurian warrior, forged in the crucible of shared trauma and tempered by a mutual respect for each other's skills and unbreakable spirits. "Are you ready for this?" Zara asked quietly, her gaze flicking to Jake's profile. "Turning your back on everything you've ever known, throwing yourself into a shadow war with no end in sight." She trailed off, an unspoken question hanging in the air between them. Jake's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to stop the slavers," he replied, his voice low and intense. "To make sure no one else has to suffer like we did, like they did." His eyes drifted closed for a moment, the faces of the fallen, human and alien alike, flashing through his mind. When he opened them again, they blazed with a determined fire. "This is bigger than me, Zara, bigger than any one person or species. It's about the very soul of the galaxy we live in. And if the Federation isn't willing to fight for that, then I'll find someone who is." Zara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a fierce grin spread across her angular features. "You're a strange one, Jake Briggs," she murmured, something like admiration coloring her tone. "But I think I'm starting to see what makes you tick." She clapped him on the shoulder, her claws pricking his skin through the fabric of his jacket. "Whatever happens out there, I've got your back." Jake felt an answering smile tug at his lips, a warm glow kindling in his chest at her words. "Wouldn't want anyone else by my side," he replied sincerely. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, until the chirp of the proximity alert shattered the silence. "We're approaching the coordinates," the ship's pilot, a skittish avian named Rill, announced from the helm. "Preparing to enter the wormhole on your command." Jake drew in a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he stepped forward. "Take us in, Rill. Let's see what the future holds." With a shudder and a lurch, the ship plunged into the swirling vortex, leaving behind the known universe and everything Jake had once called home. The journey through the wormhole was a kaleidoscope of twisting light and shadow, the very fabric of space-time bending around them in dizzying spirals. Jake braced himself against the console, his knuckles white, as he fought the rising nausea in his gut. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, it was over. The ship shuddered one final time before bursting out into normal space once more. Jake blinked spots from his vision, his eyes widening as he took in the sight that greeted them. Hanging against the star-speckled backdrop of space was a planet unlike any he had ever seen. Massive crystalline spires towered up from the surface, glittering monuments that pierced the sky and seemed to defy gravity itself. Gossamer thin bridges spanned the gaps between the spires, creating a dizzying web of walkways that pulsed with the glow of millions of lights. And in the center of it all, rising from a shimmering lake like a jewel on a velvet cushion, stood a palace of such breathtaking beauty that it stole the air from Jake's lungs. Delicate towers and soaring archways blended seamlessly with the natural landscape, as if grown rather than built. "Welcome to Aurelia," a rich, feminine voice purred over the comm. The Empress Andromeda herself, the shining heart of the collective, and a refuge for all those who seek solace from the cruelties of the universe. Jake found himself blinking back a sudden, inexplicable rush of emotion. After so long in the darkest depths of space, bearing witness to the worst atrocities sentient beings could inflict on one another, the sight of such unadulterated beauty was almost too much to bear. "It's magnificent," he managed to rasp out, his voice thick. "I've never seen anything like it." The Empress's smile was evident in her tone. "And this is only the beginning, my young friend. Here, within the embrace of the collective, you will find the resources and allies you need to wage your war against the slavers, to rekindle the fire of hope in a galaxy that has grown far too accustomed to the darkness." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine at her words, a sense of purpose crystallizing within him like a diamond. This was his path, his calling, and he would follow it to whatever end awaited him. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he replied formally, bowing his head even though she couldn't see him, "for your hospitality and for your faith in our cause. I swear to you, we won't let you down." "Of that I have no doubt," Andromeda replied warmly. "Now let us waste no more time on pleasantries. There is much work to be done, and many battles yet to fight." Jake glanced over at Zara, a fierce smile playing across his lips. "No time like the present, then. What's our first move?" The Saurian's eyes glinted with a predatory light. "We start with what we know. The slavers we faced at the camp were just cogs in a much larger machine. We need to follow the money, trace the shipment routes, and start dismantling their operations piece by bloody piece." Jake nodded grimly. "The Pantheon blades were involved, which means this goes deeper than we realized. Mercenary groups like that don't come cheap. Someone with deep pockets is bankrolling this whole twisted enterprise." "Then that's where we'll strike first," Zora declared, slamming a fist into her palm. "Cut off their funding at the source, and watch the whole rotting edifice crumble." Jake felt a thrill of dark anticipation shiver down his spine. At long last, after so many years of chasing ghosts and shadows, they had a true target to set their sights on. A chance to bring the fight to the enemy on their own terms. "I hope they're ready for what's coming," he murmured, a hard glint in his eyes as he watched Aurelia grow larger on the view screen. "Because we're not going to stop until every cage is empty and every chain is broken. Whatever it takes." And with those words, a spark was lit. A spark that would soon ignite the flames of rebellion across a galaxy too long shrouded in the darkness of oppression and fear. The slave masters and the mercenaries, the corrupt politicians and complicit corporations, they had no idea what was about to hit them. For Jake Briggs was coming for them all, and he would not rest until the light of freedom shone upon every world, and every sentient being could at last taste the sweet nectar of self-determination. Tides of change. Over the weeks that followed, Jake and Zara threw themselves into their self-appointed mission with a zeal that bordered on obsession. They pored over every scrap of intel the Dawn Collective could provide, tracing shipment routes and financial trails, piecing together the shadowy web that connected the disparate factions of the slave trade. Slowly but surely, a pattern began to emerge, and with it, a plan of attack. "It all leads back to the Collusion Syndicate," Jake announced one evening, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger as he jabbed a finger at the holographic star map floating above the war room table. They're the ones funneling money and resources to the slavers, providing the infrastructure for their raids and transport. Zara leaned forward, her yellow eyes narrowing as she studied the glowing web of connections. The syndicate's influence extends deep into the Federation itself, she observed grimly. Politicians, law enforcement, even military officers, they've got their claws sunk into every level of power. Jake shook his head in disgust, and all the while they'd present this facade of respectability. Legitimate business, philanthropy, public service, it's all a goddamn smokescreen for the rotten core at the heart of it all. He straightened, a hard light kindling in his eyes. But now we know their secrets, and we're going to use that knowledge to burn their whole twisted empire to the ground. Zara grinned fiercely, a predatory glint in her gaze. I like the sound of that. Over the next month, they launched a series of daring raids against the syndicate's holdings, targeting their supply depots, disrupting their shipping lanes, freeing every slave they could find. Jake and Zara led each mission personally, their unique bond and complementary skills making them a nigh unstoppable force, where Jake's tactical mind and innate leadership ability provided the guiding vision. Zara's lethal combat prowess and indomitable spirit made her the tip of the spear. The ranks of the freed swelled with every strike. The motley band of human and alien warriors shall strike at the very heart of the syndicate. We'll infiltrate their headquarters on Kalu Prime, capture their leaders, and force them to dismantle their slaving operations once and for all. A ripple of anticipation ran through the gathered rebels, an electric thrill of purpose. This was what they had been fighting for, bleeding for. A chance to cut the head off the snake, to strike a blow against the architects of their suffering from which they could never recover. It won't be easy, Jake cautioned, his voice ringing with grim determination. The syndicate's HQ will be heavily guarded, their security state-of-the-art. We'll be outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. Because we have something they don't. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the sea of faces, human and alien, young and old, each one marked by hardship, but alight with the fire of conviction. We have the strength of a people fighting for their freedom, for their very right to exist. We have the courage of those who have endured the unendurable and emerged from the crucible tempered by the flames. Jake raised a fist, his eyes blazing. We are the spark that will ignite the inferno, the beacon in the darkness that will guide the oppressed out of bondage and into the light. We are the harbingers of a new era, an era where every sentient being, regardless of species or origin, will live free. A roar of approval shook the chamber, a thunderous wave of sound that crashed against the walls and reverberated in every chest. Weapons thrust towards the ceiling, voices raised in a wordless cry of defiance and exultation. In that moment, Jake felt the weight of history settling upon his shoulders. He knew with a bone-deep certainty that the actions they took in the coming days would echo through the ages, that generations yet unborn would look back upon this time, this place, and marvel at the sheer audacity of what they dared to attempt. But he also knew, with an equally unshakable conviction, that they would succeed, that the unbreakable will and inextinguishable spirit of all those assembled here would carry them through whatever trials lay ahead. For they were the resistance, the unsung heroes who would reforge the galaxy through the fires of their own unquenchable thirst for justice. And as he looked out across that sea of upturned faces, human and alien eyes alike blazing with the same fierce, hungry light, Jake felt a swell of humbling pride suffuse his being. It was the pride of a soldier who had found a cause worth fighting for, the pride of a leader who had kindled the embers of rebellion in the hearts of the downtrodden, and watched them burst into glorious flame, the pride of a man who finally understood, with perfect clarity, his true purpose in this vast and wondrous universe. And in that moment, staring into the face of the greatest challenge he had ever undertaken, Jake Briggs felt no fear, only the calm, unshakable certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. and that whatever happened in the days to come, he would face it with his head held high, and the fire of freedom burning bright within his unbreakable human spirit. The end.